Good day, everyone. My name is Nathaniel Clement. In today's lesson, we will be reviewing Unit 2, Asexual and Sexual Reproduction. By the end of today's discussion, you should be able to tell me what reproduction is, why reproduction is important, what is asexual reproduction, what are the advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction. You should be able to tell me the types of asexual reproduction. You should be able to explain what sexual reproduction is. You should be able to tell me the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction. You should be able to tell me what are the types of sexual reproduction. You should also be able to tell me what genetic variation is. You should finally also be able to tell me why genetic variation is important. You will learn all these concepts as we go through today's presentation. To start this lesson, let's go over the basics and start by answering a simple question. What is reproduction? Well, reproduction is the process by which an organism replicates itself in order to make more members of its own kind or species. Reproduction allows organisms and species to make more of themselves. It allows for a population to grow and allows for a population's numbers to be replenished. There are two main types of reproductive strategies or reproduction that an organism can utilize. These reproductive strategies are 1. Asexual reproduction, or 2. Sexual reproduction. You will learn more about these two types of reproductive strategy as we continue with this lesson. Now that we have a better understanding of what reproduction is, let us learn why reproduction is important. There are many reasons why reproduction is important to a species. Reproduction allows an organism to generate more of its own kind and to keep the species alive. Reproduction allows a species to continue its genetic legacy and allows an organism to pass on its own genes. Reproduction also aids in genetic diversity of a species by producing genetically distinct individuals, which helps improve genetic diversity. Reproduction on the cellular level within an organism also allows organisms to repair damage to their tissues. It allows them to grow, and it allows organisms to develop. Now that you have a better understanding about reproduction, what it is, and why it is important, let's talk about one of the two main types of reproduction. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is asexual reproduction? Well, asexual reproduction is a form of reproduction that produces offspring without the fusion of male and female gametes or the exchange of genetic information with the parent organisms involved. This usually means that a single parent, typically a mother, produces the offspring on her own, meaning that the offspring shares 100% of their DNA with their mother, like a clone. This basically means that organisms that reproduce asexually produce near perfect copies of themselves. It's astonishing how basically nature invented cloning before humanity even existed. Now that you hopefully have a better grasp of what asexual reproduction is, let us go over some advantages and disadvantages of this reproductive strategy. Advantages include a low energy requirements. This is because an organism does not need to spend energy looking for a mate, trying to impress a mate, or developing flowers, or any such thing tied to sexual reproduction. This means that energy can then be used to create more offspring. Another advantage is that this strategy is environmentally stable, meaning that the organism can reproduce even in environments where finding a mate could be difficult. Another advantage is that organisms are reproductively self-sufficient. They can produce offspring at any time and any place because they're not restricted by trying to find a mate. Another advantage is that positive genes are more likely to get passed down because there's no mates to introduce bad genes into the offspring. Another advantage is that only one organism is needed to start a new population because a mate is not required for this form of reproduction to occur. Now for some disadvantages. Disadvantages of this reproductive strategy include negative genes have a harder time getting out of the population. This is because if any negative genes are already present in the population, there are no new mates to help introduce good genes into the population. Another disadvantage is that genetic diversity in these organisms tend to be low. Because, like I said, there are no new organisms in the form of mates to introduce new genes into the population, which would normally introduce variations. Another disadvantage with this strategy is that managing population growth can become a problem. Since there's no restriction on an organism to reproduce, they can over-reproduce because they can reproduce at any time. This can cause a population to explode out of control, which can be a problem in and of itself. Another issue with this reproductive strategy is that adapting to new environments or situations can become difficult. Evolution is driven by genetic diversity. A lack of genetic diversity can make evolution difficult or next to impossible. A final disadvantage of this reproductive strategy is that organisms can become more susceptible to disease, predation, and extinction because it's harder for them to evolve to new situations or evolve out of potential traps. Now that we have a better understanding of what asexual reproduction is, its advantages, and the disadvantages of asexual reproduction, let's go over the types of asexual reproduction. There are 6 main types of asexual reproduction. The first type of asexual reproduction that we'll discuss is known as binary fission. Binary fission is an asexual reproductive technique where the parent organism, typically a single-celled organism or the cells of a multicellular organism, split into 2 identical copy daughter cells. For example, like the bacterial cells that are shown in the image on the slide. This type of reproduction typically occurs in organisms such as bacteria, archaea, amoeba, and other single-cellular organisms, as well as in multicellular organisms such as plants, fungi, and animals. In these organisms, this type of reproduction allows their cells to replenish themselves, to repair damage to their tissues, and to allow these organisms to grow. The next type of asexual reproduction is known as budding. Budding typically occurs in single-celled or cellular fungi like yeast. During the process of budding, the parent organism splits off a small portion of itself in order to form a new organism. That small portion will then break off and then develop into a separate organism. The next type of asexual reproduction is known as vegetative propagation. From the name, this type of asexual reproduction typically occurs in plants. In this type of reproduction, the parent organism, typically a plant like banana, grows a new shoot off the main organism that then will eventually separate and form a brand new individual plant. Another type of plant that does this kind of asexual reproduction are birch trees. Another type of asexual reproduction is known as sporogenesis. Sporogenesis is the process by which the parent organism, typically a fungi or a certain type of plant like ferns, produces a special reproductive cell called a spore. A spore is basically like a gamete, but unlike a gamete, it has a full set of the parent's genome, instead of being haploid like a sex cell. This spore will then develop and grow into a new, separate organism. The next type of asexual reproduction is known as fragmentation. Fragmentation occurs typically in some types of plants and animals. Some examples of animals include starfish and some types of worms, like planarians. In this type of asexual reproduction, the organism splits itself up into smaller sections or parts that can then grow and develop into individual organisms. This type of asexual reproduction can be deliberate, where the organism deliberately separates into separate parts to create new organisms, or it could be accidental when the organism loses a part of itself or a limb from an injury from something like predation. This type of reproduction typically occurs in animals with the ability to regenerate themselves, as it allows them to regenerate the missing limb, or for the missing limb to regenerate all the necessary organs and tissues to ensure survival. The final type of asexual reproduction is known as agamogenesis. Agamogenesis is an umbrella term for other types, secondary types of asexual reproduction. But in general, agamogenesis occurs when normally sexually reproductive organisms reproduce asexually, or without the need of fertilization of eggs, or without a mate. Agamogenesis can be broken up into two different types. These types are parthenogenesis, which typically occurs in animals, such as some species of fish, sharks, snakes, and lizards, and the other type is known as apomixis. Apomixis typically occurs in plants. This type of asexual reproduction is unique because it blurs the line between sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction and tends to be quite rare. It's hardly observed in wild organisms, but has been documented in ones found in captivity. Hopefully, after this slide, you will be able to understand the types of asexual reproduction. Now that we hopefully have a better understanding of what asexual reproduction is, the advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction, and the types of asexual reproduction, let's look at the other main type of reproduction. Sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is a form of reproduction that produces offspring via the fusion of female and male gametes/sex cell, be it pollen and egg cells or sperm and egg cells or ovums, and the exchange of genetic information between the parent individuals. This makes the offspring produced a genetic mixture of both parents, or diploid. The reproductive gametes used in this process are haploid, meaning that they have half of each parent's genome. The two combine to form a diploid organism. The main difference between sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction is that sexual reproduction requires more than one organism in order to complete the offspring's genome, whereas sexual reproduction only requires one parent. This also means that organisms that are sexually reproductive need to find a mate or need to find a way to introduce the gametes to one another. Now that we have a better understanding of what sexual reproduction is, let's learn about its advantages and disadvantages. Advantages of sexual reproduction include the fact that negative genes can be more easily removed from the population, as positive genes can be more easily introduced into the population through mates. Another advantage was that sexual reproduction encourages greater genetic diversity by introducing new genes into a population via mating, as well as the random mutation and genetic drift that sexual reproduction can cause. Another advantage is that only 50% of all offspring born would develop a harmful mutation, as there's a chance that one of their parents will have a gene that can cancel it out, a 50% chance. Another advantage would be that sexual reproduction allows organisms to adapt and evolve to new environments or situations more efficiently and faster, because genetic diversity allows for evolution to take place more rapidly, as it gives something for evolution to act on. Final advantage is that this allows species to become less susceptible to disease, predation, and extinction, as it allows the species to adapt to become more resistant to disease, more capable of eluding or defending themselves from predators, and more resistant to extinction. Disadvantages of sexual reproduction include that it has a high energy requirement, because it requires a lot of energy to court partners, to find them, or to produce fruits and flowers that are required for sexual reproduction. Another disadvantage is that only 50% of any given population will be able to produce children at any given time, because only one gender, females, are capable of carrying offspring. Third disadvantage is that this type of reproduction is dependent on having two organisms of the opposite sex to be successful, which means that this type of reproduction is highly circumstantial and requires special circumstances in order to occur. This also makes this form of reproduction more restrictive, because it's not always possible to find remains in a given area. Finally, the last disadvantage is that random chance and outside influences can affect the offspring's viability and their genetic makeup. Because if an organism picks up a partner, their poor genes can negatively impact the organism's offspring's survival rates. Now that we know more about the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction, let's go over the types of sexual reproduction. There are two main types of sexual reproduction. These types are conjugation and synagamy. Conjugation is a type of sexual reproduction process where two individuals of a species temporarily fuse together and exchange their genetic material through pronuclei. This is typically reserved for microscopic organisms, specifically single-cell organisms. The other type is known as synagamy, also known as amophogamy. It's a type of sexual reproduction where a haploid female and male gametes are completely and permanently fused together to form a diploid zygote or offspring. With all this talk about genes and genetic variation, you might be asking yourself, well then, what is genetic variation? Well, let's address that concern. Genetic variation describes the amount of genetic differences or variations in each individual organisms in a given population. Genetic variations mainly occur through things such as genetic mutations, which are changes in the gene sequence of an organism that can be caused by outside environmental factors such as UV light or internal cell repair. It can occur through gene flow, which is the movement of genes from one population or from one area to another. Or genetic variation can occur through sexual reproduction, because as part of sexual reproduction, in the creation of gametes, genes get altered as they are mixed within the organism and when the two haploid gametes, sperm and eggs, combine. This promotes genetic diversity or genetic variation. Let's talk about genetic variation. You might be asking yourself, what's the point? Why is genetic variation so important for an organism? Why is it so important that it can determine whether or not their mode of reproduction is suitable for the species, or that genetic variation could cause a species to go extinct? Well, genetic variation is important because it allows species to evolve. For those who don't know, evolution is the process by which random mutation, along with natural selection, causes a species to change over time. Evolution cannot happen without random mutation and natural variations, because these variations could be the positive or negative genes on which natural selection acts upon, which causes changes in the population, or causes evolution. Genetic variation allows for a species to evolve and adapt to their environments as their need arises. Variation within a species gives the species the ability to evolve, as if the variations give something for evolution to act upon. It also allows for negative genes to removed from the population in order to keep the population healthy. Organisms with high genetic diversity become more resistant to extinction as genetic diversity or genetic variation allows them to adapt and change to catastrophic or drastic changes in their environment. Reproduction plays an important role in genetic diversity and genetic variation because it is the mode for how genes get passed on from one generation to the next. It's also important for genetic variation as reproduction can cause genetic variation or can hinder it, depending on what type of reproduction or what mode of reproduction an organism uses. Now that we have a better understanding of reproduction, what it is, why is reproduction important? Asexual reproduction, the advantages and disadvantages of this reproductive strategy, the types of asexual reproduction. We have a better understanding of sexual reproduction, its types, its drawbacks and upsides, and what genetic variation is and why it is important. Let's go over a few fun facts about these topics to help consolidate what we learned. Did you know that yeast can reproduce both asexually and sexually under certain circumstances? When yeasts are in a plentiful environment full of nutrients, they reproduce asexually so they can rapidly build their population while times are good. Then, when times get tough, they reproduce sexually, which allows them to get an extra boost in genetic diversity and allows them to evolve to rapid changes in their environment. Did you know that in 2021, at the Calabun Aquarium in Italy, there was the first documentation of a smooth-hound shark being born parthenogenically? This was the first time that parthenogenesis was identified in this species of shark. Did you know that conjugation can help bacteria develop antibiotic resistance? Conjugation can allow bacteria to spread antibiotic resistance amongst themselves, between individual to individual, and even from one species to another. This is one of the reasons why antibiotic resistance is so hard to regulate and control, because it can spread so easily throughout a bacterial population. And finally, did you know that some organisms, like fish, some fish, snails, and slugs, are hermaphroditic, meaning that they produce both male and female sex cells or gametes? In the cases of some fish, like clownfish or sheephead fish, these fish start out male and develop into females, so they produce two types of gametes throughout their entire lifetime. While in snails and slugs, they're born with both male and female gametes and produce them throughout their life. This means that they can both provide gametes to a partner and receive gametes. Isn't this cool and interesting? If you have a further interest in this topic and want to do your own research, here are my references for this presentation. I always encourage for individuals to do their own research so they can learn and get new understanding at their own pace. I would always want to encourage students to both do their own study and research as well as to provide references in their work to avoid plagiarism. For the rest of the references, for those individuals who are interested in further education in this topic or for further research. We have reached the end of today's lesson. Hopefully, you have learned from this presentation what reproduction is, why reproduction is important. Hopefully, you learned from this lesson what asexual reproduction is, its advantages, its disadvantages, and the types of asexual reproduction that organisms utilize. Hopefully you learned from this presentation what sexual reproduction is, what types of sexual reproduction an organism can utilize, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction. Hopefully you also learned what genetic variation is and why it is important to both an organism and to reproduction. I'd like to thank you for joining me for this presentation. And on behalf of e-Biome, thank you for joining us for another wonderful, amazing presentation. Thank you.